Women in Focus, a podcast by British Naturism. Hello and welcome to Women in Focus, a podcast brought to you by British Naturism. I'm your host Helen Berryman, and today we bring you episode 26. Happy New Year everyone, 2026 is here with a bang. And we've got lots to look forward to at British Naturism, including a brand new ladies only clothing optional holiday in Crete. We are heading to Vitramartis on the 1st of June. And if you would like to come along too, details of how to book will be on the show notes. And we have got a cracking episode lined up for you today. In the first of a two-part conversation, I'm excited to speak with Professor Annebella Pollen from the University of Brighton. She's the author of Nudism in a Cold Climate. I've been so excited to talk to her, and she was an absolute delight. And we talked for so long, we've had to do a part two. So enjoy, sit back and listen to Annebella Pollen. Annebella, thank you so much for joining me. I've really been looking forward to talking to you. Also a little bit nervous. You are semi-famous. So, hello.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. I think you're much more famous. I've seen your appearance on many a daytime TV programme and all over everywhere. So, yeah, great to talk to you and to share some perspectives on this shared interest from which we're coming from quite different perspectives. But I think we've got quite a lot in common.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to exploring it. So just to begin with, would you mind telling listeners a little bit about who you are and the work you do for those who might be discovering you for the first time?
Sure. I am an academic as part of what I do. So I'm a professor of visual and material culture at the University of Brighton on the south coast of England. And what that means is that I research and I write books about things to do with visual and material culture. So broadly, that is images and objects and their histories. And the things that interest me tend to be ordinary things from everyday life. So I'm very interested in popular photographic practices and the kind of ordinary things that people collect in their homes. So photography is a big interest of mine. And I'm also interested in subcultures and countercultures. So I've done quite a lot of research about alternative lifestyles, and I've written various books, and some of those things come together in one of my books, which I've written about the history of nudist culture and nude photographs of nudists or naturists by nudists or naturists. So that's my kind of reason, I guess, why I'm here today, but it's just a little part of what I do, really. So I do other things as well as that, but this book is something that I've been thinking about for a long time, and I'm really happy to talk to you about it and how it relates to other things we're both interested in.
Brilliant, lovely. So when did the book come out? It was a couple of years ago now, wasn't it?
The book came out at the very end of 2021, but it didn't really kind of circulate in the world until 2022. But I had written a bit about nudism or naturism, historic nudism or naturism. I think the first article I wrote came out in something like 2017, 2018. I started writing some academic articles, and really I've never stopped, because after the book came out, there was still lots more to say, things that I hadn't been able to expand on in sufficient depth, or things that didn't quite fit the kind of framework of the book. So I've carried on publishing on subjects around nude photography, nude cultures. So I guess I've been sort of thinking about this in one way or another for a decade or so in my writing. But as we might explore, it's something that's been kind of an interest perhaps for about 30 or more years in one way or another. Yeah, so that the book, the short answer is the book came out in 2021, Nudism in a Cold Climate.
It's a great book, actually. It must have taken quite a long time to write. How long did it take you to write?
Thanks very much for saying it's a good book. I really appreciate it when nudist naturists are readers and you bring something quite particular to it. I didn't necessarily write it for nudists or naturists, but obviously that's been a kind of part of the audience. Yeah, I started researching it in maybe 2014. Something like that. So I had a 2-year bit of funding from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which is basically it's like a UK government research body that funds research, and it goes out to different areas of different subject areas. And the Arts and Humanities Research Council is one of those areas. And I had pitched way back in about 2013, 2014 to write about attitudes and practices around outdoor living in the 1920s and the 1930s, and specifically to look at some outdoor kind of youth movements, the British woodcraft movement, so a kind of small group of outdoor enthusiasts who had kind of utopian ideals. And one of the things I knew they were interested in was gymnosophy, or early nudism or naturism. So I probably started looking around the subject in 2013, 2014. I got stuck in earnest in 2015 and 2016 when I started visiting the archives of British Naturism and reading a lot of historic magazines. And then, so the first articles came out in 2017, 2018. So it's been years, really. And the book was also really informed by being stuck in the house during lockdown and being unable to visit any archives and thinking, what can I do to keep myself sane using material that I already own? And I'd bought over the years many examples of Health and Efficiency magazine and similar magazines at car boot sales and online auction sites. My partner's a second-hand dealer. He deals in ephemera and bric-a-brac and things like that. So I had quite a lot of stuff in the house. So I thought, okay, I'm going to turn this into something bigger, and I can do it, or at least I can make a start on doing it with some materials that I've got at home, because of course I couldn't visit any archives or go anywhere. So it probably did a bulk of the research and the writing in 2020 in those lockdown times.
Oh, that's interesting that you've brought up lockdown, because for me, that's when I discovered naturism as well. So if it wasn't for being stuck indoors and actually having really nice weather that year, then it would be a whole different story. But so a lot of your research, from having read the book, you must have spent a lot of time at Speelplatz.
I didn't spend time at Speelplatz, no. And this is the interesting thing about my research methods, is that partly because I was stuck indoors, but partly because I wanted to capture a story that was harder to capture from living memory, because basically the book looks at the emergence of naturism as a culture in Britain. So it begins really in the early 1920s. And then I decided to stop at around the early 1970s. So what I wasn't really doing was kind of looking at the lived experience of naturism in the present day, partly because I felt like that was a story that needed to be told from an insider perspective. And I consider my perspective to be mostly an outsider perspective, but also I was interested in public debates, and especially as they appeared in relation to the image. So I was very interested in the nude photograph and how that became the sort of public face of British naturism in its early days. It became its most kind of public tool for attracting people to join, but also to kind of learn about the organisation. And it did so through magazines. So most of my research is through printed magazines and photographic archives. And of course, I needed to kind of speak to people as well who were naturists in the present day and read their perspectives. But it didn't involve the kind of site visits that you might expect a researcher to do. And some of my other projects have been absolutely about that, where it's been about the lived experience of practitioners. This was more about kind of dealing with and examining a kind of public discourse. So I could do that by looking at magazines. I could do it by looking at publications. And I was interested in that kind of aspect because a certain kind of voice comes out in a magazine or a book that is probably quite different, and a certain kind of public image comes out that is definitely quite different to the kind of naturist practitioner experience. So I was interested in kind of contrasting those, but I mostly did it through things like reading the letters pages to those magazines. That's where I captured the voices of naturist practitioners rather than sort of interviewing people. So no, I didn't really go to clubs at all. And I did later in 2023, 24, I did a short film with some naturists. I did it at the White House Naturist Club in Surrey. But that was the first time that, present day practitioners had really formed a kind of larger part of what I was doing. I was absolutely dependent on the generosity of naturists because I used the archives of British Naturism. So I had to win over the trust of naturists who were at the helm of that organisation, who needed to understand what I was doing and that I had a kind of legitimate interest. So to a certain extent, I worked with naturists, but a lot of what I was doing was historic. So there weren't that many people around to have perspectives on the 20s, 30s, 40s and so on.
So before you began your research, what was your own relationship like with A, your body, and B, naturism, if any at all?
Well, yeah, naturism, that's really interesting because I mentioned that I see my perspective as a bit of an outsider perspective, but it all depends on how you define naturism, doesn't it? So naturism in recent surveys and recent polls where, there have been national surveys to try and ascertain who naturists are and how many there are, the definition of naturism is very, very broad. It includes people who might have gone naked on a beach, who might go naked in a hot tub, who have appeared naked socially in a range of different contexts. So in that sense, I would say that I have some kind of naturist practice and naturist sympathies, because I'm really happy, in the right place and with the right people to be naked among friends. And, I've skinny dipped, where the opportunity has arisen my whole life. I've also been to things like hippie sort of free festivals, probably since, being a kind of late teenager, probably the age of about sort of 17, 18, 19, where I've been around people who've been naked in a festival kind of culture, because I spent years in my late teens, early 20s, hanging around with hippies and witches and wizards and pagans and alternative living people for whom, gathering naked in camps was kind of part of what we did. So those weren't naturist groups. They weren't kind of British naturism recognised societies. I've never been a kind of formal member of an organisation like that. But I've engaged in kind of socially naked leisure practices as part of those cultures in my 20s, and also in my late teens and early 20s. I did a lot of life modelling. So when I was about 19 or so, I moved in with a woman. She had been to art school and she was a really keen and enthusiastic artist. And she had always drawn from the life model. And then she'd also, when the opportunity arose, she used to earn a bit of money life modelling, and I knew nothing about it till I met her. I had no contact with kind of artists who were engaged in that kind of world or work. And one time she couldn't make it to this life drawing class where she was going to be the model, and she asked if I wanted to do it. And I sort of quizzed her about what it would involve and critically what it would pay. And I discovered that it would pay a lot more money than I was earning per hour working in a shop, or, kind of minimum wage. It would pay like 4 or 5 times that. So I went, oh, okay, well, really, I just sit in a room and I take my clothes off and they're going to pay me loads of money. And I went as an experimental thing to be a life model for a life drawing class. And I found it really enjoyable. I really liked all the people who were drawing me. A lot of them gave me drawings at the end. These were amazing. They're some of my most precious possessions, because it was people who were sort of later in life, retired art teachers, retired professionals, and sometimes continuing exhibiting professionals. So I got amazing artwork. It's a sore side of myself that I would never see through artists' eyes. I found it totally unproblematic to sit naked in front of lots of people looking at me. Lots of people would say, oh God, don't you mind? I said, no, it's the easiest thing in the world. If anything, I really enjoyed it. It was not that I was neutral about it. I really loved it. So I did that for loads of different art groups. And I only really stopped because I moved away from Devon and I lost those networks. But yeah, so I suppose I've had a toe in the water of some cultures that are adjacent to naturism, even if they're not formally naturists, my whole life. And I wouldn't say that I wouldn't describe myself as a naturist now, but I think I've got an understanding of what it means to be semi-publicly naked and socially naked through those experiences, which enabled me to have a little bit of an inside view of some of the things that I was writing about.
I just picked up on the fact you said you left Devon. Whereabouts in Devon were you from?
Oh, well, originally I was born in Plymouth and then...
Me too.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's funny. That's funny. But a lot of this was happening around South Devon. So the communities in Dartington and Totnes, which is a known location for sort of experimental living. You know, I was really involved in those kind of experimental cultures. And I lived for a time in a caravan with New Age travellers. And I lived among kind of people who were, I suppose, the next generation of hippies. So, you know, I sort of enjoyed being part of those alternative communities. And they crossed all sorts of kind of body cultures. So we used to do things like go out for kind of naked walks. We'd build steam rooms like sweat lodge saunas and things. And that was done naked. We'd go skinny dipping in streams and rivers, things that might now be called wild swimming. So there was a whole kind of community around South Devon of people who are leading those kinds of lives. And I learned a lot from them. I'm no longer kind of part of that world in the same way now. I'm a respectable academic. But I sort of learned a lot from that really formative period between about 18, 19 and about kind of 24, 25, maybe the years in which some people go to university. I didn't go to university then, I went later. But those formative years really shape who you are as a person.
Wow. So it's interesting that although you're very sort of happy to get involved with social nudity or festivals and things like that, and the same can be said for a lot of the younger people that we speak to, preferring not to label themselves any sort of ist or ism.
Yeah.
And, you know, they don't want to subscribe to any club or any kind of label. I'll give you an example. 2 of our children, or Simon's 2 from his first marriage, who have grown up with Simon being naked, they have no issue with taking part in a festival or a naked run with their father or coming to visit us at a club. But they would never sort of label themselves in that way because they don't feel the need to. Can you relate to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, some of the things that, especially as came out when I was researching the book, some of the kinds of formal cultures around, you know, what used to be called nudism and then later was more popularly called naturism. Some of the historic examples showed me how the need to develop a kind of formal culture around it, which in some ways seems quite work-like. I mean, in my sector, the real passion killer is all the committee meetings that I have to go to, where there's secretaries and treasurers and minute taking and all of that. You know, it's quite a work-like environment. And I can see how in the early days of nudism, that was really important for establishing a culture of respectability, for creating a formal sort of organizational structure that would give people meaning. It would give the movement legitimacy, especially in the early days when it was viewed with enormous suspicion, if not total hostility. Creating a respectable professional culture of respectability around nude practices was really important. And it was also a way for screening out members who might be perceived to be undesirable. So there's quite a lot of kind of organizational structure that enabled membership to work effectively, and it enables some kind of protection for organizations. However, I think, you know, some of that over time fell away and some of it seemed undesirable. And it often was associated with an older person who was a middle-class professional who wanted to bring kind of, you know, ideals from the world of work into their world of leisure. So they might be involved in various organizations that have similar kind of structures and cultures. I think we live in a different sort of time now. And so maybe some of those requirements are not so necessary and they're also not so appealing. You know, people might want to just flit in and out of an organization, not necessarily sign up as a subscriber, sign a manifesto, you know, sign up to a code of practice or whatever. It might just be something that people do more casually. I mean, in terms of offspring, that's also an interesting thing because my daughter grew up around at least me being kind of normally naked at home and not being bothered about, you know, her seeing me in the bath or whatever, or having a bath with me, or, you know, going to some of these kinds of festivals where all kids are running around naked. And there was a kind of culture that she grew up in that she says now she's really happy that she grew up in that culture because she thought that was normal, but she's learned from some other families, you know, they just never saw their parents naked. They never went on these kinds of hippie experimental sort of festival holidays. And she's got her own relationship to nudity through that, where she and her friends have been really happy to go to things like naked bike rides and they've enjoyed that sort of informal culture, which may or may not be sort of naturist with a capital N, but, it's about creating their own culture and their own environment in which they feel safe. So, yeah, I think she's learned as she's grown older that not everyone grew up in that way. And some people who didn't grow up in that way have rather awkward and uncomfortable, as she perceives it, and maybe I would perceive it, sort of excessively private familial relationships where, a child can't enter a bathroom if a parent is naked and things like that, which just seems to me really kind of hard to maintain. And why would you want to? So I think perhaps kind of growing up in a fairly libertine environment has left a legacy on her practices. She's now in her late 20s.
Okay, similar to our lot. We've got 25, nearly 23 and 18. So let's go back to the book for a little bit.
Sure.
As you became or immersed in the archives, did your personal understanding of naturism begin to shift? Did you see different things?
Absolutely, definitely. Because really I didn't know very much about it at all. So I wasn't sort of turning up at the archive with a great deal of preconceived ideas. I was going in with, an open mind, wanting to learn, but I didn't know a great deal about it at all. I mean, I think, what did I know? It's hard to remember now because now I seem to know everything. But at the time I knew absolutely nothing. Maybe I'd kind of brought a really top level kind of public understanding of naturism as it was depicted in picture postcards of being this kind of viewed in a sort of comical and slightly salacious manner. I mean, there are elements of nudism and naturism that are, I think, inherently comical because being naked in a closed world is something that it takes people by surprise. And the things I think that take people by surprise are sometimes the things that cause people to laugh, whether it's nervous laughter or joyful laughter. I've been quite interested in that kind of tension about things that might be perceived to be a bit of a joke, but what do they actually mean? So I suppose maybe if I did know about the comic aspect of mockery around nudism, it was something that intrigued me. So maybe things like Carry On Camping and the interwar sort of saucy seaside postcard where nudist camps figure. I'd certainly never been to one. I didn't know what it was like inside. I'd seen magazines like Health and Efficiency knocking about because, as I mentioned, my partner's a second-hand dealer and I'm often interested in kind of historic materials, and I've spent a long time, going around car boot sales, buying historic bits and bobs that intrigue me. So I kind of knew a little bit about that, but I'd probably only seen a few examples from the 50s and 60s where they're a bit more like kind of pin-up magazines in their depictions inside. I certainly had never sat down and read a book about the philosophy of nudism. And even as I said that I practiced some kind of nude cultures, I had not been reading books about them. I'd just been participating in some kind of leisure because it was part of the sort of scene that I was in. So when I first started reading about nudist or naturist practices, I was really, really surprised. And especially when I started going back to the very earliest published writings that came out in English, which, the first sort of publications around nudism, or initially it was called Gymnosophy, those completely surprised me. So when I first discovered this word Gymnosophy, I think I must have been reading about some of these outdoor groups from the 20s, because that was where I first discovered it as a kind of formal research theme in my work. So I was reading these utopian magazines produced for and by vegetarians, outdoor health enthusiasts, people who are kind of talking about the health benefits of fruit juice, talking about the benefits of sunlight on skin. They tended to be perceived as cranks in the 20s, these people who were part of these groups. They were interested in alternative medicine, alternative ways of educating children, alternative diets, maybe alternative lifestyles more broadly, including kind of new ways of relating. So maybe experimental relationships between women and men. And somewhere in reading these publications, I saw lectures about gymnosophy. I thought, what is that? Quickly looked it up and discovered, wow, that is really a kind of polite synonym for nudism. It's the word for nudism when people weren't able to say nudism out loud. They called it gymnosophy because it combined these Greek words for nudity and wisdom. It gave a kind of cultural legitimacy and a kind of philosophical basis to this practice of going socially naked. So I started looking at who these people were who were giving lectures, what they were writing, And I discovered this amazing seam of philosophical literature all about, the meaning of nudity, its benefits, not only for the body, but also for the mind. And the people who were writing this stuff, they were those kind of vegetarians and natural health enthusiasts and social reformers, but they were also philosophers, doctors, psychiatrists, early psychoanalysts, early sociologists. So it was a really intellectual body of material that I was reading. And that really surprised me, because if I had any sort of ideas about naturists or nudists, it was not that it was an intellectual thing. It was something that was a kind of, a health movement or leisure movement. So I got really interested in those early days of, this intellectual years, I suppose, in its foundation. And a lot of the people who were writing for the nudist magazines and producing nudist books, I discovered were people that I knew from elsewhere. So I knew that they were writing books of social reform, or they were writing about sex education. And especially women, I started to notice that people who I knew from their feminist campaigning were also part of the early nudist movement. They were early gymnosophists, early nudists, early naturists. And I had no idea about that when I first started reading this material. There was a really strong intersection between socialist and feminist campaigners and nudist practitioners in the 1920s. So, I kind of learned everything for the first time, and it really opened my eyes to something that I thought, well, if I don't know this, other people must not know it as well. And there's a really interesting story here to tell about something that people don't take seriously, that they snicker about and, make innuendos about. But actually, there's this kind of really deep and really powerful and really persuasive set of ideas about what being naked together might achieve. So I got super interested in it, and that was the basis of the first writings that I did.
I've got loads of questions from all of that. On the Women in Focus podcast, each of my guests, I ask the same question, and I just wonder what your view on it is. Is there a difference in your mind between naturism and nudism?
Well, I use the terms interchangeably because I understand that, really, as this again comes out of my research, that from the 60s in Britain, naturists preferred their practice to be described as naturism. Again, I feel that's shifted, and there's a whole range of terms that are in use now, and it depends on where in the world you live and what you see your practice constituting. But the names, for me, I suppose I think of them in historical terms. So Gymnosophy was this early name that
I love that word.
In the early 20s.
We should bring that back.
It's a complicated term. It doesn't roll easily off the tongue. People don't know what it means, but it was important to the early practitioners that what they were doing was a philosophically based thing. Nudism then became more popular in the 20s. It entered the Oxford English Dictionary in about 1930, I think, which was a kind of important moment in achieving publicity and legitimacy for this new term. So I think, there was a wide understanding of what that meant in the 20s and 30s when it was first achieving some popularity. But then I think, nudist practices can be really, really broad. If it just means public nudity, then it starts to intersect with forms of sexual nudity that the card-carrying club members, who were the philosophers and people in the membership organisations, they wanted to be disassociated from. So there's always this really kind of strong antipathy with sexual practices or towards sexual practices. So the public understanding of nudism was always suspicious that there was a sexual element to it. This history is well known. So some nudists preferred the term naturism because it would imply it was more of a health movement.
Right.
And in some of the early definitions, people who are arguing for naturism say naturism is something very specific. It needs to be outdoors. It needs to be related to health and exercise. People who are interested in naturism often tended to be non-smokers, teetotal. They weren't drinking, they weren't smoking.
I'm out then.
Yeah, exactly. So, that's really shifted because by the 60s, nudism or naturism in Britain was not this high-minded philosophical affair anymore. It was aiming to be more of a mass movement. It was trying to do away with all the folk dancing and the sort of high-mindedness of the early years, which was seen to be a bit embarrassing and sort of getting in the way of the ordinary people who they wanted to reach out to. So I think it really kind of depends. I find nudism a lot easier for people to understand because sometimes people who are not naturists get naturism mixed up with naturalism.
Yeah.
And they think it's the study of animals. And I've had many people introduce me as having written a book about naturalism, or even saying that I'm a naturalist. So I think, and even quite educated people get in a bit of a tangle about it. So I think nudism is easier to understand. People talk about nudist camps, and they know what a nudist camp is, even if it's like an imagined thing in their mind. So I suppose I find it a more useful term because it's easier to understand.
You've mentioned quite rightly that a lot of people have done a lot of studies about the benefits of nudity in terms of, well, the philosophy and what it can do for your body image, self-image. And it's been proven. There's been topics and papers on it over years and years, which have been made public. Why do you think still the wider public will laugh and guffaw at the practice of naturism and nudity? And why do they always assume it's sexual?
I think possibly it's something to do with the sort of British conditions and the British mentality, because there isn't the same kind of comedy around it elsewhere in the world. So in Germany, for example, and other places in Central Europe, it's not considered to be so ridiculous. It's not considered to be so comical. It's an accepted part of kind of public culture. And, what I was saying earlier about the sort of taboos that some families have about seeing other family members naked and things like that, that is just really, really hard for some people to understand who've grown up in a different kind of cultural context. I often have conversations with academic colleagues, whether or not they're, researchers of nudism, who've grown up or are based in Germany or Finland or places where there's cultures of nudism, cultures of sauna cultures. And they say, these kinds of attitudes, these kind of smirking, giggling, awkward attitudes are something that they just don't have in their culture. And they see it as something that's to do with perhaps Britain or maybe the US as well, as cultures of prudism, cultures of sort of, strict cultures in the US that view some of these Central European and Northern European naked cultures as kind of horrifying. But I think in Britain, there's always been this kind of awkward comic thing about nudity. So I think that's a sort of legacy of a rather uptight, sort of buttoned-up culture where, those long-standing ideas about no sex, please, we're British, and so on, those kinds of ideas that sort of sexual culture is something that you keep behind closed doors or behind closed curtains, or, you do it under the covers in the dark or whatever, so nudity is awkward, and that is absolutely bound up with sex.
Right.
So I think it's really, really hard for people to disassociate nude practices from sexual practices. And it's always been the case. That's been the battle since the earliest days of nudism, from my research anyways, always about separating in the public mind nude practices from sexual practices. And for the early nudists who were trying to argue that being naked socially together had psychological benefits, as well as health benefits, exposing your body to the sun and the air and so on. It was always the battle, because everyone used to think, well, really, they're just having an orgy, and they're using all this philosophical language to try and legitimate some kind of subversive sexual practice. There's always suspicion, hostility, and so on. So I think, it's the embeddedness of not having public cultures on a large scale where people gather together naked in ways that aren't sexual. And I think probably it also isn't helped by the fact that when, things shifted in nudist cultures in the 60s and 70s, quite a lot of nudists went, oh, actually, we never really believed in that kind of separation of sex from naked bodies. And quite a lot of nudists went, okay, we were having to say those things because that was the party line. But now we live in different times. Let's embrace more open-minded sexual cultures. And when, some nudist clubs became swingers clubs, and where some magazines that had only been showing naked bodies because that was all that was permitted by law, when the laws broke down, they turned those magazines into pornographic magazines, or photographers became pornographers. So I think it's a complicated thing, separating out nudism from sex in the public mind. And maybe people think as well, you can get a lot of psychological and health and well-being benefits from other places. So if they don't want to go nude, they can do other things. They can go to a sauna. They can go sunbathing with a small swimming costume on or bikini on. Yeah, so I think, some of the kind of health claims about exposing your body to the sun some people might say, well, you can get that without having to go fully nude. So I think there'll always be some people for whom it seems too outlandish, too impossible to kind of countenance. Yeah.
And some of the things I've come up against when I've been on the television or radio or whatever it might be, is that as soon as there is a naked man present, he is immediately dangerous. Why is that? Is he not going to be dangerous dressed?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, the sort of safeguarding thing, isn't it? And, again, the gender thing as well, because looking back into the history, which is, of course, what I know more about than present day practices, men were always perceived to be somehow suspect, on the border of not behaving themselves. And early nudist clubs put various kinds of codes of conduct in place to try and subtly or otherwise address a concern that men might be somehow sexual voyeurs. Of course, this is a time when it's really, really hard to see naked bodies. We live in a different time now. Mm-hmm. Why would anyone be going to a nudist event to see naked bodies when you could see them click of a button online? Yeah. But in different times when viewing naked bodies was really difficult to do outside of very limited domains like medical publishing, art publishing, naturist magazines, a lot of the audiences for naturist magazines and a lot of the members of naturist clubs were people who were going to have a look, and especially men going to have a look at this forbidden fruit that you just never saw publicly. Where could you see naked women publicly? So I think, there's always been this kind of anxiety that men, and it's a cultural myth that men are kind of more highly sexed, more interested in sex, and therefore a naked man looking at women is somehow more sexually threatening. I found it really interesting reading kind of naturist historical literature that, women's interest in potentially looking at men's bodies is barely ever addressed. When I did find it, I got really interested in it because, of course, women have got an interest in people's bodies as well. Women like to look at naked women's bodies. Women like to look at naked men's bodies. We're all curious about bodies. Bodies are endlessly fascinating.
They are.
Yeah. I mean, I've always really enjoyed going to swimming baths, for example, where there were communal changing rooms. When I was a young woman, I used to really enjoy going to a women's swimming hour or women's swimming morning or whatever at my local swimming pool, where there would be women of all ages, all naked together in the showers. There was nothing sexual about that encounter at all. It was just that women who might ordinarily go into a cubicle or women who might keep their swimming costume on if it was like mixed showers, because it was all women, everyone would get naked because it's more efficient to get yourself clean and washed, without a swimming costume on when you come out of the swimming pool. And I'd just really be fascinated by seeing women's bodies in their 70s and 80s and perhaps even beyond, and even middle-aged women, because, when you're a young woman, you just don't see those kinds of bodies in public culture. And I used to look with, curiosity and interest and enthusiasm and fondness. I think, my breasts are going to go like that. Will my thighs and my stomach go like that when I'm older? I'd look at the reality of women's crinkled skin and, the different shapes of what, women's bodies become. And I'd look with real fascination. So I think there's a kind of lack of discussion in the historical literature about why women might like to look at men's bodies. It's all about this fear of men looking at women's bodies and what will they do? Will they become kind of sexual attackers, sexual voyeurs? I've no doubt that some of that, did and does go on, has gone on. But yeah, there's something kind of very gendered about the idea of a threat.
Yes, no, there is. And still, it's brought up all the time that the men are dangerous, not just talking about it in naturist movements or environments, but, we could go off topic here and talk about people in the police force and people in scout groups, church groups, whatever that might look like. And it should be challenged on behaviour, not what you're wearing or not wearing,
Yeah.
But I want to talk a bit more about the photography side of things that you've seen in magazines and the papers that you've looked at and researched. So your book looks closely at visual culture.
Yeah.
How did photography shape naturism's public identity over the years?
Yeah, it's so fundamental. It's I'm very interested in how photography got put to use in the in the magazines and the books. So yeah, it's a great question. It's a big question. I'll try and answer in a pithy way. So yeah, right at the very beginning of the first kind of publications about nudism in Britain, they tended to be unillustrated or very, very sparsely illustrated, partly because they were works of philosophy. So it wasn't really about how bodies looked or what bodies looked like. It was also partly to do with the mechanics of printing and the cost of reproducing photographic plates. So, there's quite a few of the early books that I read, the 1920s books that are there at the founding of nudism in Britain that are unillustrated. And one in particular, I remember, it's Nudism in England by Reverend Norwood, which was one of the first books that took a kind of national view of the country. There had been books published in England about nudism or gymnosophy worldwide, where English or British cultures featured briefly, but nudism in England was the first book. So this was 1933. It was written by a Church of England vicar, which is interesting in itself. And it had a very small image on the cover, taken at some distance, of a male and female nude group dancing in a circle in a sort of woodland setting, so distant that you wouldn't be able to identify any of the people, so distant that if anyone had salacious intentions, they were going to be prevented from realising them. And that was a text that inside was completely unillustrated. And I had borrowed a copy through my university library from the British Library, because that was the only place that held a copy. And when it arrived, it really amused me that on the first page someone had written in biro, no pictures, because they had obviously gone to look at this book with the hope of seeing naked bodies, and there were none. So, I think after that there was a kind of shift in a couple of different ways. One was that popular magazines started emerging. So Health and Efficiency was a newsstand magazine. Sunbathing Review was a newsstand magazine. You could buy it at any train station. You could buy it in W.H. Smith's or, big newsagents or even small newsagents. These were the kind of health magazines that were promoting nudism as a cause throughout the 30s, and in Sunbathing Review's case up until about 1950, and in Health and Efficiency's case right up to the present day. So they became quite strongly illustrated because they wanted to attract a wider audience, and they made a feature of the fact that they had tons of photographs in. And I think, some of the people who were buying those magazines were buying them to look at the photographs because there were very, very few places where you could see photographs of nude bodies. And the kinds of nude bodies that were depicted were a mixture of actual practicing nudists in nudist camp settings. So they might be all ages, literally from children to pensioners, lots of different body shapes and sizes, from the very thin and, underweight and perhaps slightly malnourished to the more kind of corpulent, larger body sizes. Yeah, so a real mixture. And the photographs tended to be photographs of real nudists doing real things in camp. So they might be digging latrines or, constructing the swimming pool or putting up tents or frying bacon, or in Spielplatz's case, sitting in the restaurant, doing the things that nudists did. But actually, a lot of nudists did not want to have their photographs taken. A lot of the early nudists in the 20s, 30s and so on, they hid behind pseudonyms in their writing. They didn't publish their names because it was a risk to their respectable professions to be seen in this way. So articles were sometimes anonymous, sometimes published behind pseudonyms. Photographs tended not to name who was in them. They'd say a nudist scene or something, or scene in a camp. So people didn't have their names attached. And sometimes they didn't want to be photographed at all. So the magazines often wrote about their own photographs, and they said, we've got a problem because nudists don't want to be photographed, but also the public doesn't actually find the idea of an older, fatter,
a real body.
Yeah, a real body digging a trench, dressed in nothing but a pair of wellies and, covered in mud up to the knees. They don't find that an attractive promotional image for our movement. And part of the purpose of magazines was to shift copies, of course, but also to promote nudism so more people would join organisations. They had a real promotional side to them. They were trying to recruit. So they tended to put in images that they thought people would find attractive. And sometimes that was heroic bodies of men posing, muscular and, kind of shooting a bow and arrow, a kind of idealised sort of Adonis type figure. But more prominently, it was attractive photographs of young women, young, tall, slim, beautiful, white women who tended to be professional models. So they didn't mind posing for naked photographs because they were dancers, or they were stage performers, or they were pin-up models, or they were life models. And so those kinds of women tended to really dominate magazines. If a beautiful woman was put on the cover, more copies would sell. And there were lots of discussions about the sort of tension about making these idealized bodies the public face of the movement. But, it really helped promote nudism. It helped sell magazines. Whether people ended up signing up and joining up to clubs is another matter. But, these magazines could sell 100,000 copies per issue in a time when there might only be 3,000 paid up nudist members. So there's a discrepancy between people who like to look at the photographs and people who join the movement. But that idealized, beautiful body became really, really dominant as a sort of photographic motif for nudism, really until, about the last 20 years or so.
So that brings us to the end of part 1 of my chat with Annebella. In our next episode, we continue this conversation, looking closely at what her research discoveries reveal about gender, power, and representation within the naturist movement, and why these visual histories still matter today. So once again, Happy New Year, everybody. Thank you for listening to Women in Focus. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, like, share, and of course, join us for part 2. I've been your host, Helen Berryman. Join us next time as we bring more Women in Focus.